President Dr. Fitzgerald and Chairman Professor Keating, Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. May I thank the Chair for his very kind words and his introduction. And as he said, it must have been very challenging to be in GOC South. Well, being a Limerick man living in Cork and having them beating you every Sunday can become very challenging, I can tell you. I appreciate very much, ladies and gentlemen, your attendance here today. It is a pleasure for me to give you a presentation on EUFOR Chad RCA, an EU crisis management operation. And by way of information, the operation finished and we got our last troops home in the very end of May. And the very last 7 people came home from Chad on the 7th of July. Sorry, the 3rd of July. These are the very last. And I'm delighted to say that everything has gone pretty well on that score. I would just before I start like to introduce there's Colonel Con McNamara, who is here beside me. Con was the man who used to do an awful lot of the briefing. He'd be well known to the Institute from his time in the Command and Staff School, but for me he was in operations and the front of house man in Paris, and when I would try to hide from people like yourselves or the media, Con was the man that I pushed out to answer the awkward questions. And I won't say to tell lies or anything like that. Okay. Now, today, the format of this is going to be along the general lines of this following slide. The first 5 bullet points that you see there will more or less deal with the political background against the military operation as it was launched and the political strategic milestones. The decision-making process that went into the planning and the generation of the force. And I will conclude with a few short words, and the Professor mentioned there that finance, and it's still not finished, but also some observations, which I think may prompt questions from you at the end. The French OHQ at Mont-Valérien. It's on the west side of Paris. You can see some very prominent landmarks there in the distance. It was chosen for the planning, direction, and the guidance of this mission. Quite a different environment, I can assure you, from that existed in theatre in Chad and in the Central African Republic. The OHQ was 270 kilometres from our political strategic decision-making centre in Brussels and 4,300 kilometres from the military theatre in Chad. Now, being military, and everything in the military always starts with a threat assessment. And I can assure you that this is absolutely no different. So you're going to, by way of background, I want to say some words to you, which I hope will give you the background to see where this mission evolved and how it was, and the understanding of the operation. The region is characterized by complex relationships between states, the kernel of which are the challenges surrounding the Darfur region, which remains the geographical centre of gravity for a multidimensional regional crisis. Both Chad and CAR remain characterized by a number of distinct but intertwined political, military, and socio-economic dynamics that continue to produce a persistently unstable and volatile political and security environment, both within the 2 countries and regionally. This area of the Central African region is decisively influenced by the smaller conflicts within, namely by the various rebel groupings seeking a transition of power away from the current regimes. Indeed, in the past year, there has been a significant evidence of an increase of the level of armaments in the region. In understanding the context in which the EU Operation Chad is set, it is essential to appreciate the political complexities of the region. In establishing the threat on a military strategic level, one has to look into the total picture of the environment as well as the multitude of actors and issues that are shaping the current overall political, military and security situation of the Central African region. Countries in this region are amongst the most impoverished, underdeveloped, corrupted, ill-governed and undemocratic in the world, with very few indicators of positive development in recent years. It is a region of complex and mixed ethical, tribal, religious and cultural divisions, merging into a very harsh climate and environment, not controlled by border lines which in most cases have been decided by former colonial masters. There are a number of different active rebel movements in the region, as well as cross-border disputes between the states, in many cases where these rebel bases are based. Terrorism has also got a footprint in northern Africa, but thankfully for us, there were very few indications of terrorism in Chad, CAR, or in Cameroon. Key individual players, current and former presidents, politicians and rebel leaders, with rebel and military forces controlled by them, sometimes from being in exile. It is an area with a lot of unexploited natural resources. That is why there is an interest of both African and out-of-African actors to influence and guarantee access to these resources. We are well aware of former colonial masters and the traditional major powers, but also the emerging major power of China is, of note, is the second largest energy consumer in the world and imports 1/3 of its oil from Sudan. China has also, when we were there, got on exploration rights on currently unexploited oil resources in Chad. But all world powers, there is a lot of interest concerning, for example, access to uranium. The insecurity of the local population, created by all of these factors, together with the effect of the climate change, has resulted in a huge concentration of nearly 6 million refugees and internally displaced persons in the border region of Sudan, Chad, and the Central African Republic. This situation is constantly changing, but unfortunately, mainly deteriorating. We discovered that the principal and more concrete security concerns for EUFOR operations, in the area of operations, and the fulfilment of the key military tasks were violence related to criminality and ethical dispute, targeting the local population and the humanitarian workers. Continuous activity and constant presence of rebels was fueling this. The risk for the local population, United Nations, non-government organisations, European Union, and to be caught up in fights between these rebels and government was always present, and indeed was illustrated very starkly on a number of occasions. If we move and speak for a moment about rebels. It is important to stress that the problems of refugees and internally displaced persons as IDPs inside Chad is the result of regional instability inside both Chad, neighbouring Sudan, and the Central African Republic. In 2003, two rebel groups in Sudan, the Justice and Equality Movement, GEM, and the Sudanese Liberation Movement, SLM, waged conflict against the Khartoum government, seeking a share of power and a greater distribution of wealth and resources amongst the population. That conflict still continues. Some 230,000 Sudanese refugees fled across the Chadian border, and some 15,000 across the Central African Republic border at this time, and they remain in both countries. Indeed, unfortunately, the numbers have increased since then. Chad supported the Central African Republic politically in dealing with this problem, and Sudan became their common adversary. GEM, that rebel group, Chad and Sudan have continued to provide logistical and financial support to respective rebel groups. Amongst these, Justice and Equality Movement, GEM, has emerged as the largest Sudanese rebel group, causing major concerns for the regional stability. In northeastern part of EUFOR area of operations, GEM continue to operate from their bases and independently conduct hit-and-run raids into Darfur, including an attack against the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, last May, 12 months. The fact that the northern part of eastern Chad is used as their base for military operations in Darfur continues to be a particular concern affecting the local security situation. High-profile military successes have raised GEM's political and military weight. The Chadian rebels operating from inside Sudan have been equally active, and in their attack against N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, in February 2008, very nearly succeeded in toppling President Déby's regime. Although the Chadian rebel factions have not yet been able to find a united position in order to launch another cohesive and coordinated assault from Darfur through eastern Chad to N'Djamena, the potential still exists for such an attack in the future. To date, internal fragmentation and a lack of internal logistic support has ensured that they remain fully reliant on the government of Sudan for support. Although the International Criminal Court's indictment of President al-Bashir last February has restricted at that time, while we were there, the government of Sudan's support for the Chadian rebels. However, the continued existence of numerous armed groups with thousands of fighters near the Chadian border cannot be ignored, and they will continue to pose an unpredictable security factor in the region. As a consequence, the government of Chad has injected substantial funding into restructuring the Chadian armed forces. Chad's military strength has improved significantly with extensive military equipment acquisitions, modification in tactics, and restructuring of forces, especially in what was our area of operations. This has shifted the regional military balance of forces in favour of Chad over the rebels and Sudanese armed militia. Now, that was by way of background, ladies and gentlemen, and into where we were in relation to that. Now, the establishment of EUFOR, therefore, was part of an overall response from the international community to the crisis in Darfur, which spilled over into neighbouring Chad and CAR. And in the summer of 2007, the Darfur crisis received major international recognition. Even film stars got in on the act at the time. And the developed world came under major pressure, and it was quite immense at the time, to do something. Indeed, I recall reading an article by former Uachtaráin Mary Robinson requesting and extolling the world to get involved, and indeed for Ireland in particular to get engaged. A French initiative under the newly elected President Sarkozy and Foreign Minister Kushner gave credence to an EU intervention, which prepared the way for political and military initiatives. And on the 12th of September, the EU approved a common approach to the crisis management concept relating to the deepening humanitarian crisis in Chad, coupled with the armed attacks of rebel groups, as I've mentioned before, which was threatening the people of that region. And I just want to take a little quote here from the EU political objective, which was important to me as an op commander. It was in order to avoid the worsening of the Darfur crisis and possible spillover into the neighbouring regions. The EU wishes, in close coordination with other actors of the international community, in particular the UN and the African Union, to contribute to solving this crisis through the use of a spectrum of political, humanitarian and security instruments within a comprehensive and regional approach in which the European Union Special Representative has a key coordinating role. That EU Special Representative was appointed, and it was Ambassador Torben Brule of Denmark, a man who I grew to work with very closely and an outstanding gentleman, and we had excellent working relationships. And so, the political and military strategic milestones. The United Nations also considered the crisis within the Security Council and passed a Security Council Resolution 1778 on the 25th of September 2007. This resolution provided for the deployment of a UN mission in CAR and Chad, namely MINURCAT, as the professor said, and authorised the European Union to deploy forces in these countries for a period of 1 year from the declaration of the initial operational capability. And on the 15th of October, I was appointed as the operation commander, and Jean-Philippe Ganassia, Brigadier General for France, was appointed as the force commander. This action also enabled the activation of the EU OHQ for the operational planning and multinationalisation of the AHQ, and that all happened with the arrival of augmentees from member states. Planning by the OHQ at Mount Valérien commenced formally upon the activation of the OHQ on the 15th of October. However, advanced planning was enabled by the agreement of the Council to authorise the French headquarters at Mount Valérien to act as operational planning authority, as from the approval of the crisis management concept on the 12th of September. And this was pending the formalisation on the 15th of October. And when I arrived on the 15th of October, there were 27 staff in situ. Planning had also been facilitated with the conduct of an information gathering mission to theatre in August 07 under the auspices of the EUMS. And the OHQ finalised the CONOPS in early November, and following its approval, work commenced on the fourth generation. Significant difficulties in the fourth generation process, I think, are well known to you all, and some of them 5 fourth generation conferences involving member states and potential third countries were held, and they were necessary before we reached a workable proportion of the full EUFOR requirements. The main difficulties arose in critical capacities such as fixed wing and rotary wing assets, as well as medical facilities. A particular planning challenge was that planning had to take into account that no clear end state was defined, as no yet decision had been made on the follow-on arrangements. EUFOR had no end state, but rather had an end date. And considering the extent and complexity of a process of handover to a follow-on force, definite planning could only commence relatively late in the operation when it became probable that a UN force would replace EUFOR. This is a very fussy slide you're looking at here. I would just refer you to the couple of red ones down at the bottom of the 15th of October. All of this, EUMS, EUMC, PSC councils and all that, and all other things, all had taken place in the August-September 2007. 15th of October, we enter stage. We are then into a very short period. But you can see right over here on the left, fourth generation. I could not go with a positive recommendation to the PSC until I had sufficient assets. And it was a very, very difficult time. And we looked that it was the 28th of January before the Council was able to formally launch the operation. And by no coincidence, on the 28th of January, just as it was formally launched in Brussels, the rebels attacked from Sudan and put everything into chaos for about 2 weeks. That allowed us, once we had launched, I've just thrown this up very briefly. It was an envisaged timeline, and it was also what transpired. When you look at the very first part of it there, joint action, the precondition, all of that happened in the period October to January, October 07, January 08. We then get into the question of Council decision to launch, and we're into a period preparation before initial operational capability. Well, that was where we had to get troops into theatre, find out the situation that was there, and then start for a 1-year period of operations. 15th of March, as it transpired, became the day that I declared initial operational capability. Now we had 12 months. In that 12-month period, there were a number of factors. We had to deploy the main part of our force. We had a mid-mandate review, which was the first time that we could look at the end state as distinct from the end date. We had a rainy season. And it was something that I was in fear and trepidation of, because the stories about the rainy season in that part of the world were quite frightening. We did eventually get to full operational capability on the 12th of September. And from there to the 15th of March, we conducted operations at a very high tempo. And then there was the handover to the United Nations and the recovery. I want to show the next slide. I'll let you read it yourself, but there are a couple of aspects to this because this is the mandate. And during my complete period, I was forever and ever being asked questions that we were merely an extension of a major power's political or diplomatic or colonial past, and that we were being their lackeys. You will see 4 crucial things here. And the very first one is that the United Nations authorized this mission. And the second area there is it was for the European Union would be take all the necessary steps, but in arrangements between the 2 host countries. This was not an extension of anybody. This we had a very, very clear and definitive mandate. Now we move forward. What are we facing at this stage? Well, geographical considerations. You will see there that blue area, that little green area there in the middle. There was something, I just want to make one point about it. There was not 1 kilometre of paved roadway in our area of operations. Not 1. If we look at the next slide, we see Europe. And if we put this into context, we see there's Chad. Goes from about Belmullet over to someplace around Folkestone, and you could take in Barcelona for your holidays and Mallorca and go down to Alicante as well. That's Chad. There were 500 kilometres of paved roadway in that, and there were 7 petrol stations. And put into our area of operations into that, you see where we come. That is us, where we are operations, but we were working in the complete in Chad. So, I went on a visit immediately after being appointed in October 07. And I won't say frightened, but I must say I was struck by the dearth of facilities and what I was getting myself into. And it became very evident that infrastructure was the key to if we were going to have any success in this area. You look at Jemena. We decided that would be our rear headquarters, but in actual fact, for initial troops going in, it was going to be the forward headquarters because it was the capital. And if we go across to Abacha, the black line there is the area of operations. Abacha was going to be our main headquarters, a very, very, very poor town. And that, because there was, in both Jemena and Abacha, there were tarmac runways. There were hard runways. EUFOR Chad, Gajbaida and Beirut were selected. Beirut is in the Central African Republic. Very simply, there were dirt runways there that you could possibly develop. And that was the basis of that. We then got to building. Jemena Airport. When we went there, if you had a cargo plane coming in, you would have to unload it on the runway, take everything off so that it could turn around and take off. That was what was there. So one of the big issues was to develop aprons, etc., in order to be able to facilitate deployment. Operate first phase, we wanted to have be 1st of May, the capabilities to take an Antonov. Phase 2, the 15th of May, and the phase 3 was coming the 15th and be fully operational the 30th of June. There were aspects to this that were something that I wasn't prepared for, I may as well be honest, because in order to do this, there was quite an extensive amount of money to be used. 23 million euros, in actual fact, was the amount. And the contract, in order to build this, get it in place before the rainy season so we could deploy our troops, there was a timeline. All this was fine in our concept of operations, but as I mentioned before, we were having problems with force generation. So we couldn't launch the operation because we didn't have the forces. But if we didn't build the apron, when we got the forces, we wouldn't have been able to deploy. And it was the original Catch-22, and I remember a staff coming to me, Conrad I think would remember it well, and John here would remember it too, in about mid-December 2007, and saying, General, you have to sign the contract for 23 million. And there was every possibility. I said, how much will we lose if this mission doesn't go ahead? 9 million. I don't know whether we had a bottle of whiskey or what, but I made the decision to go for it. And We had a very lonely Christmas, I can tell you, in 07. But one of the things I discovered when this thing was signed and everything was done, the contractors discovered there was no cement in Africa. And we had to source cement, eventually got it in Portugal, shipped it, cost 6 million. We got it in, and in the first week of January, we got the necessary resources to go ahead. It was built, and it came on stream, a magnificent facility. There it is. It was in use in May. There's an Antonov in the front there. There's another one, an Antonov being unloaded. And now we're on to our first camp. This was an old prison in N'Djamena. It was disused. The only thing that was there were the walls outside. That was built. General Nash got on the road and got down and started building this. It was all tentage at that stage. And it takes 600 people. And indeed, from there you will see the airport in the background, and we built a road from there to the airport as well, so that we could have direct access from the planes into there and have it as a launching pad. Forward to Abacha. Abacha was somewhat different. All mud, low buildings. But in Abacha was a French camp, Camp Crossy, the Pervia forces. And we had this problem about not being French. We were EUFOR. And therefore, using French assets was particularly difficult in the public. So France was very kindly allowed us to take it. We needed a staging post because all we had was a brown earth. You see that place on the north side of the runway there? That was identified, and that's what the Chadians would give us to build a camp. We were able to put our force headquarters, our Roll 2 hospital from Italy, and our Special Forces headquarters in there, bar off that part of the camp, fly the EU flag over it, and France very kindly conceded to that. And our Special Forces went out somewhere there to the left of that slide and built a camp for 450 Special Forces under tentage. We look forward to about 5 months later. Here's a satellite photograph of the camp in Abacha, Europa camp. 2,200 people could accommodate. It's a very fine camp now. There is one of the aprons, that's the west apron, and built to take all the flights in. And there is the east apron. And all of that has been handed over to the United Nations. But all those were operational. They took a while. It was right into midsummer of 2008 before we were able to finalise that. And then there were the camps, to build the enabling works for the camps. All of those orders were fully developed by the European Union and by the operational headquarters and the force headquarters. Camps were developed enabling works for the camps so that troop contributing nations could come in. For instance, we were responsible for the defences, we were responsible for the levelling, we were responsible for water and various things like that. This is Ariba. This is in the north of the area of operations, and the Polish and Croatian forces were stationed here. One of the big problems we had with that, there was no water. You can see it's a very barren area. Absolutely no water. It took months and months of drilling and a lot of money to get water. That area also, the Polish battalion also had a platoon headquarters in a very sensitive area out in a very, very remote area in a place called Garida. We moved to EUFOR Chad. Now, this was the French camp and Slovenian. And the French, it was my great introduction to an expeditionary force, because France literally moved in to this place. There was nothing there. We had built the barriers around. They moved in, complete, and they built the camp around themselves. Now, some months later, I was there in a very wet period, and the place was awful, muck and dirt. It was an appalling place. And I remember getting up at the morning sometime, and in the tent was about 3 or 4 inches of water. So you stepped out of the bed into about 3 or 4 inches of water. And I was feeling sorry for myself going off to a cup of tea or something in the breakfast with the French in the morning. And Cyril Brennan, who was my policy advisor, now I was fortunate, I had good army combat boots and things like that. Cyril from the Department of Foreign Affairs and first secretary now in Paris, back to Paris, and being a clear man, and he was passing me by and he said, Christ, he said, the French, only the French would make a virtue out of hardship. He was going around in his Paris flip-flops, and but that was for China. We come to the Irish area, and here we have Gajbaida. Gajbaida, you see the runway there, and you see a very fine camp. I went there in April 2007, and the Irish had just, we were building the earthworks, and the Irish were just moving in. I went back with Dr. Solana in first week of June of that year, and the camp was built. Tremendous achievement built, and I must say, here was a classic example of the benefits of the partnership that we had bought into in, what was it, 2000, 2001. The professional Irish scene, a credit to everybody. Now, you see down here that it's very green, and in the winter time, there's beautiful vegetation all around. And Con McNamara was prone to, particularly when you get rather stuffy bureaucrats from Europe someplace, and he'd be briefing them, he'd say, and this, the next phase, the Irish are building a 9-hole golf course here. And you could see people sometimes saying, should I report this? Or is this where European money is going? Now, we're into Central African Republic, and this is Birao. Birao is a very remote, only accessible by air. The particular town had about 25,000 people. The hospital, I went into it, was a building with no windows, no doors, one nurse, no medicines. Incredible. It was the only place I saw children that appeared to have symptoms of hunger. And it was basically from what their diet. Their diet was very much a root that grew and that. France set up a level 2 hospital there, and only for that level 2 hospital. It was a huge input into that area. Sweden and Finland also moved troops in and out at various stages in the earlier part of the mission to Birao. So, the strategic lift, in order to get us there, very briefly, almost 2,400 units through Douala Port in Cameroon. 2,000 kilometres from N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, and a further 800 kilometres across to the area of operations. And then out to the various battalions. You will see there a couple of comments I make. You see the 7th of December, France. You see the 20th of January. And you will say, how come the mission wasn't launched until the 28th of January? Well, it's a bit like the contracts. If we didn't send people into theatre, we wouldn't be in a position to be able to run the mission. Because once we got launched on the 28th of January, we had to be able to get up and go. And nobody would have thanked us for sitting at home and waiting for the starting whistle to go. So we were covered by that legally as well, may I add. The next one is 21 raid convoys through Cameroon, considerable distance. Nangagura, I think, is the name of the station up in the north of Cameroon, where the convoys would go, and then off the convoys onto road convoys, and on up into Chad. There's a road convoy, 2,000 kilometres to N'Djamena, and then across again. You see protection there, and it's a magnificent African vista, that one. And you look at strategic airlifts. Now, these were of very serious flights. You'll see the heavy lift and personnel, 40, which would have been to get people in, things like Antonovs, etc. The next one is the one that I would like to make a comment on. These are the countries who contributed troops. 23 European Union countries came on board, which was quite remarkable. And indeed, Malta, who did not provide troops, made a financial contribution to humanitarian effort. You see that almost 10,500 troops passed through EUFOR in its period, just over 15 months in operation. But I would particularly like to draw your attention to Albania, Russia and Croatia. Albania, the three countries, non-European Union. Albania, never before involved in an international operation, came on board, and indeed stayed on to become part of the UN. Russia, in spite of the Georgia crisis being at its peak in the summer of 2008, were kept on board, and I would like to thank Dr. Solana for the support he gave me in relation to that in particular. And indeed, the French presidency at the time, you will recall the President Sarkozy and Kushner and Mr. Solana went to Moscow at the time. But we, at our level, were able to keep Russia on board, and we were rather pleased with that one. And Croatia, an aspirant country to a member of the European Union, produced very fine troops as well. The assets were received. This is I won't go into it in great detail, but IOC is initial operational capability, mid-mandatory review, full operational community, and transfer of authority. I will just show the blue lines. The blue lines there are the people who rehash it to the United Nations. If we look at the air assets, we had a great battle. We eventually got them. We got a lot of assets. And I want to make particular reference here to the flexibility and the goodwill of various countries. You see, for instance, Greece there came on a week-by-week basis. That's the broken line, which was tremendous for us with Hercules. But for a lot of countries that are not shown there, people like Austria, Belgium, people like the Netherlands and Sweden and Finland, when they would fly in relief flights from their home countries, whether they'd be C-160s or C-130s, they would stay for maybe 2 days, do a number of sorties for us, and then fly back out. That was the goodwill we got within the European security and defence policy and the family of Europe, which is an important message to make. Tremendous, and they weren't in a position to give us full time, but they supported us. And that was it when we got to September. Now, strangely enough, by the time you get to September, we'd lost an awful lot of troops because the special forces, by and large, had gone home. But that was the layout in September. I won't dwell on it. Now, our mission. I'll ask you to just have a quick look at that. And it's important, and how multidimensional it is from the point of view is protection. There is no such thing there as imposing anything. And then we look at it is against the backdrop of what I pointed out at the start with the threat assessment and the political disruption and rebel activity that we found that this was the disposition of the refugees and the internally displaced people. A very strange thing, but not strange because of the geographic. You see where the refugees, the percentages are in the north. And if you look at the IDPs, the big percentages are in the south. The fact was that in the north, these were the people who were displaced from Darfur into Chad. And the internally displaced people in the south were the Janjaweed and these people who used to come from southern Sudan through Central African Republic and Chad and drove the local people from their villages in Chad. And that's the background to that. So that's in a snapshot. Here is a refugee camp. They're there since 2000, first of them in 2003 and a lot of them in 2004. You will see it's highly organised. UNHCR and people and NGOs and all that, schools, hospitals, food, everything like that. And of course, it's way better than their home villages back in Sudan. And that's the statement you must make. Way better. And you see and of course there's a problem with the indigenous people who have a problem because they see this. And the Chadian people who are living in the villages around here, by the way, that's near Gajbaida, near the Irish, that one, are much worse conditions. So just to take note of it. Now, here's the internally displaced people. Scattered all over the place, bits of plastic, all of that type of thing. Had to run from their villages and all that. But I wouldn't want to say that they're not being looked after. They are. But not to the same degree, because here you see, this slide will show you where the NGOs and people like that have set up. You even see a water truck there, I think, down in the bottom. And you will see where they are being looked after. but not to the same degree, because the Chadian government wants them to go back to their home villages. So if you make life too comfortable, they won't go back. Now, we now are building our camps, getting our troops in. We had to have, what are we going to do? So our intent, we start in the north, the presence for security operations. What does that mean? Well, it meant because you had the refugee camps up there, and the big issue was to try and stop recruiting by rebels, etc., from the refugee camps, interference with the refugee camps, and in that context, Poland and Croatia had their brief up there. In the centre, robust security presence. France and Slovenia, Ireland and the Netherlands had that responsibility in there in the middle. This is the traditional avenue of approach of rebels both ways, not both ways, from Sudan into Chad, across that whole central area. In the south, deterrence. This was where to deter the Janjaweed from coming in, and they used to come in groups of maybe 100, maybe up to 200. Rape, pillage, steal, and do everything. Indeed, Prime Minister Abbas, at one meeting with him, was at pains. We were coming up to a situation that he was really annoyed over another thing that happened there. He said in the previous 2 years, 800 elephants had been slaughtered by heavy machine gun in that area. Now, we could never verify if there were 800 elephants ever in that area, but it is a magnificent place in the wet season. Beautiful growth. There are lions, there are tigers there in that area, not very many, and it's a dangerous place because the bush is very close. You have very little protection. But that was, and we had quite a few run-ins with various people, banditry, rebels and smugglers and all sorts of criminals in that area. Particularly our special forces got involved in them a couple of times, and we're glad to say we came out the right side. Now, if we are going to, what do we need? During all of this period, when all of this is getting the plan together, status of forces agreements with the countries, technical arrangements with everybody that we were going to have, contracts. And for me, as the op commander, it was establish a visible, credible and flexible EUFOR. Also, establish a strong liaison network. And that was our objective. To do that, we had to get information. Very simply, we needed to know and we needed to be seen. In very simple language. EUFOR situation was achieved through a use of multiple sensors, satellite imagery, air and ground reconnaissance, special operations forces, human intelligence, and CIMIC teams, and all underpinned, and we had a very special, which you'll see in a moment, geospatial team, and all. Their job was to get the information, get this area of operations and get us information on it. Ground operations were based on a detailed analysis of the area of operations and remained focused on designated areas of interest. And air operations, including unmanned aerial vehicles, provide valuable security. And that was, all of that was done. Huge effort for the first couple of months. One of the results of it is, you see here maps. Whole area was gridded. This is the type of thing that was done by, and this is the type of map that was produced, issued to the troop contributing nations as they came in, but also, of course, NGOs, United Nations. We were in a position, now at a fee, we must say, we were in the marketplace as well, so this was costing us money, so we were looking for money back. But this was quite a geospatial team were absolutely fantastic. From the time of going in, all of this stuff was produced in about 3 months. Special operations, special forces. I'm going to deal with them because it's a subject that, particularly in Ireland for some reason, it takes on certain connotations. We made it part of the initial entry. Special forces must be a small, self-sustainable, rapidly deployable, light logistics footprint. That's what we needed. It was the build-up. France came in initially, 24th of January, second French element, followed by Sweden, followed in by Ireland. The Army Ranger Wing, I must say I was highly valuable members to the whole organisation. Then came Austria, and finally Belgium. We had 450 by January. Now, we talk about special forces, and everybody thinks of desert rats and all of that type of thing. Well, when they have to, they are. But in our case, there was a broader. We wanted liaison, intelligence gathering. This was a vast place. What was going on? Airstrip, we saw some of the airstrips. The validation, could we use them? What works needed to be done on them? Access, roads, route verification, support, but a big issue, CIMIC and information operations, getting the word out to the local people, who we were, what we were about. We were multinational, we were neutral, we were impartial. So while they were doing all of that work, the air reconnaissance was going on, and they were gathering intelligence. So the people on the ground were finding at one stage, and you have all this was done by Mirage, French Mirage. You hear UAVs. Huge program went into all of this, all fed back into our intelligence cell back in Mount Valerian, which was headed up by a Finnish naval captain. This all led to the work of the troops on a daily basis. But I would like to emphasise, before I come to the daily basis, what did it really lead to? You look here at this and it's all very colourful. You say, what the hell are those bubbles? Well, they're very simple. They are weeks of the year 2008 and 2009. And those are the locations where combined joint operations took place in those areas over maybe a 2-week period, where a battalion, that would be a company from each of the multinational battalions, with a tactical headquarters, often led by the first commander himself, with up maybe 10 or 11 helicopters, with a major medical support, with all sorts of communications, and with support of various types, would move and saturate an area, find out all the information, what was going on there, and try and bring a sense of safety and security to the local population, and it worked extremely well. On a daily basis, what went on in tandem with that was 255 long-range patrols. Long-range patrols would be anywhere from about 10 to 14 days. The troops would go out, live. That's a Swedish flag I see on that one there. And here we have patrolling. I see some Irish people here, actually. The foot patrol, they're Dutch down at the bottom. And that's nearly 2,300 short-range patrols. That would be where they'd come back. Quick reaction forces. I want to just make one. Back in Abacha, there was a quick reaction force all the time. But I want to make one point about the quick reaction force. You see medevac there on it. Now, quick reaction force had to be flexible, robust, but they also have to have a broad spectrum. For us, medical support, you can appreciate bringing Western European Union or European Union standards to a place like Africa is very difficult, and it's indeed one of the great problems in Afghanistan at the moment as well, where an injury has to be in a level 2 hospital within 2 hours. Soldier must be within 2 hours. Now, I'm not going to get into the HSE problems or anything like that, but for us, we had 3 level 2 hospitals. We had dedicated helicopters. It was one of the problems we had in the 4th generation. People would say, but you have enough helicopters. You have more helicopters than you do. I hadn't enough helicopters. I had enough helicopters to do medical support in a theatre like Africa, but then there were no helicopters left for operations. So if you put helicopters out to operations, you were putting your troops at risk. That was the type of situation. It worked extremely well. There were 2 hospitals from France and 1 from Italy. And magnificent medical backup, I must say. I was in the Italian one day, and there was a surgery going on. And the surgeon brought me in to show me when the patient had just been finished and the other doctors were tidying up. And they were in direct contact with a surgeon in Naples with a video link, cross-checking that the operation was going in the right way. It's quite extraordinary. It's just where we have come in relation to this whole area. But 3,000, over 3,000, we were not there to look after the local people, because it's a very difficult thing. Because the moment you go in looking after the local people, and there's two former chiefs of defence down here from Ireland are here, they will know the local doctors have a problem because they're losing business, so you can't get into that area. So therefore you must have the local doctor refer you, and that was the but over 3,000 patients, consultations were done in our short period of 12 months. And there were 65 major surgeries conducted in those hospitals on local people. Those people would be dead. There's no question about it. Now, you mentioned the rainy season. This is it. You can see this lovely, dusty place. And look at this. That's an Irish vehicle up there on the top left, I think. I don't know how he's going to get out of that. Okay. But the ambulance is even in trouble, as you can see. And that's the rainy season. We were delighted with one thing. Because of our air assets, we were able to keep up the tempo, operational tempo. Disposal was not an issue for us. We were not there to do that. But my goodness, it was one of the great, most heart-wrenching things to come across. The number of children who were maimed by ordnance was quite awful. The number to see them in our hospital, either the French hospital or the Italian hospital, and to go in and to see poor children blown to bits was awful. Special Forces. We went from 450, but we kept 250. These were the people who moved around surreptitiously after we had taken over and the battalions got into place, and particularly when it came to dealing with rogue elements. They were extremely effective. CIMIC. Now, CIMIC played a critical role, civil-military relationship, in the development of positive working relations and establishing an understanding amongst the humanitarian community of the modus operandi of EUFOR. And this was extremely important to us because I'm going to deal with it again in another area, dealing with NGOs, to try and develop goodwill, continuous dialogue, cooperation, and to build confidence. And to try, big issue for me was to try and get some sort of formalised arrangements that we could communicate with each other. They did it very well. Site survey. Once we're there, we're in situ. These foot patrols and all of those, they're writing reports. What village? What tribe? What are the tensions? What's happening? All of this would go back into independent analysis and was fed back to Brussels and was also fed to the United Nations. And this is the liaison with the NGOs and indeed international organisation. It's a crucial area. It's regrettable there are many issues. And the fault is on all sides. General Nash, Ambassador Brule, and myself were painstakingly trying to get this working properly. We had a lot of success. And I must say, in this context, great praise to the Irish battalions and successive Irish battalions out there who took a lead in this area. And we have a great feel for this type of thing, and we're highly successful. Much acknowledged by organisations such as the UNHCR. We did build a relationship with 71 of the NGO organisations that were in, quite a lot. I think there were 77 in all. There were about 6 of them who just wouldn't look at the same side of the street as us, but that's it. We didn't have a problem with that, except on one of them did create a terrible fuss one time when we didn't rescue them, and we didn't know where they were. So anyway, but it always happens. The exception proves the rule. Gender and cultural issues. It's a very important thing in the context of European Union, and particularly European security and defence policy, and where we're coming from. I was fortunate and I looked for gender advisors, and I got 2 at different stages, both Swedish, 2 ladies, and I placed her on the command group, which there were a few old hairy or hoary old soldiers who weren't, they were probably hairy as well, who weren't too happy with having a gender advisor in at command group meetings, but it worked very well. Indeed, the first lady I discovered was graduates had done a lot of time in University of Limerick, so we were able to compare the quality of the pint in the hurler's pub. But when I discovered that she knew an awful lot more about hurling than I did, because when I asked her did she know anything about Limerick hurling, she said she never heard of them. So she knew full well that they were on the downward slope at that stage. But we had 2 excellent and balanced professional ladies who made a huge contribution to this whole business. And we issued gender guidelines. Arrangements were put in place to fully develop gender issues within the operational structures. And the focus then moved from the OHQ to visibility and security situation from a gender perspective. And that was all captured. And it involved training. And these people actually, I must say, Ireland took a lead in this as well, because these ladies were invited over to do part of the pre-training for our soldiers before they left. And other countries began to develop that as well. And the whole thing was to try and see, could we have a gender balance within the distribution of information. We had a problem, and one major problem. And that's when you go to the elders, they were all male. So the message was not getting out to the female part of the population. It just wasn't. And these people, and they came up with marvellous ideas. We were able to recruit, primarily from France, Muslim members of the French forces, female Muslim ministers, who were able to go to theatre and speak directly with the women. We got into a lot of trouble with it. And I let poor General Nash take all the flak, because the senior politicians in some countries were not too happy with this. We were undermining the culture of the country. But it worked. It worked, and worked very well. This is an awful fussy slide, but I'm just going to make a very small reference to it. People talk about this big bully boy, Europe, going in and doing something, this military, isolated military organisation, going in to suppress a country and all of that. Well, when you look at the liaison structures that are put in place and the checks and balances that are there, from Paris, I think it was 44 or 45 times I had to go on the train to Brussels to explain myself to almost everybody and anybody in Brussels and justify what has to be done. I had to justify myself in the United Nations. I had to justify myself to the troop contributing nations. I had to justify myself to the host nations, and indeed, on one occasion, I had to justify our position to African ambassadors, permanent reps to the United Nations in New York. There is no greater oversight, I can tell you. And having had a lot of experience with the United Nations, the European Union as an organisation has much more oversight on its military operations than any other organisation that I know of. Now, I'm going to go very quickly through this. We got them in, but then we had to sustain them. Just very briefly, I think we have some figures here. I could only get the slides. We could only get the slides. The 31st of December, which was for a 8.5-month period. 8.5-month period. 11 million cubic metres. I think it was 1,122 tankers of fuel to keep the operation going. If we look at bottled water, 522 20-foot containers, or 870 trucks. A lot of thirsty people. Yeah. And if we look, I think there's fuel, or there's rations coming up as well. Yeah. They succeeded in eating 2,122 tonnes and an 800 of food in the period. So they were well fed out there. By the way, that's an Irish field kitchen that you're looking at there. Let me move to Menorcas very briefly. I'm very conscious of time. Menorcas was set up as part with the same Union Security Council resolution. And this was part of the overall, that in tandem, that Menorcas would move in. Mr. Angelo da Silva from Portugal was appointed the Special Representative of the Secretary General. We had problems. Am I going to say a lot of problems? And it was only in February of this year that they were able to get to where they wanted to. With, you see some figures there, 850, which is the ultimate figure there, of getting the locally trained police in place. We had the task of providing security. We also looked at the whole question of, we gave them a security umbrella. It allowed them to deploy. We also supported them logistically. And you will see in the next slide where in our camps, the UN would move in and build their own. And they were then able to carry on with their operation. That leaves me. The operation has been ongoing. The handover. I think I'll be very brief on this because I think we're behind schedule. And just to say, very protracted. Took a long time. We got there. Huge goodwill between the United Nations and the European Union, and I think it was a catalyst for future development in this area, and I'll come to that at my wrapping up. We succeeded, and on the 15th of March, Mr. Savella on the left, Foreign Minister Kushner, obviously there's something happening out there I'm not too happy with, and I see the Under-Secretary General, Mr. Lawa, has been cut out of that picture for some reason. That was the handover. There's the Force Commander and the handover ceremony in Chad, and there we are again. General Conji of Senegal. And the rehashing, troops putting on the blueberry. And here's the recovery. Now, this poor Irish soldier was obviously in the mud, recovering his Mohawk back to Ireland. But it wasn't like that, I'm glad to say. And indeed, Ireland rehashed it, as we know. But we did keep, after the rehashing, a quick reaction force. We provided the medical support. We provided staff capabilities until the 15th of April. And then we did an awful lot of work in relation to contracts for the United Nations. We got the main body out by the end of May, as I said already, and the final few people home on the 3rd of July. And we're back to Douala in reverse. It's just a few slides. We had to get all that out. Effects. Now, I will let you have a quick look at that. But for me, those were the words of Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, in early January. We were happy at that stage that we had turned the corner. We were getting credibility. And indeed, we were happier when we handed over in March, because at that stage, the mission had become successful. And if I jump forward to that, we see that we were a multidimensional and multifaceted. And the EU Commission had a major part to play. They were the people who identified safe areas. And they were the people who had looked at what projects would go ahead. And you see here just a quick show of a number of villages that were identified. In all of this area, the European Commission were doing economic projects as well. We were the people who provided the security and set the scene. Set the scene for when we were leaving. We reckoned that there were 40 places that are likely to take place, and in actual fact, first evidence of 22 of them had taken place, and that's what we handed over to the UN. I mentioned finance. I just want to say about finance is that Athena Special Committee approved a budget to me of €119.6 million for 0708 and 18.6 million for 09. And that was financed in common, people who know what we're talking about, and to conduct the operation and to provide for the recovery. And quite a lot of money. You can see all the infrastructure that was put into it. Glad to say that I do not have Mr. Lenihan's headaches. We came in under budget. And also, we are still fighting with the United Nations to get some more money back from them, and we'll even be more under budget. And I'm very pleased that the Swedish presidency of the European Union has been a tremendous support to me in that area. On the 25th of September, I will present the budget, the audit of the accounts in Brussels, and immediately after that, European Union will, I expect, take the joint action and relieve the operation commander of his responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a few observations to make, and I'll make them very, very quickly. Having been so closely involved with EUFOR, it is hard for me to take a detached overview. Others will be in a better position. However, I am grateful to have had the opportunity to play a part in mounting such a complex multinational operation into a very unstable security environment, into a distant theatre of operations that was geographically, as you saw, and climatically most inhospitable. And in the course of that operation, to witness how the life of ordinary people, IDPs, refugees, not forgetting the humanitarian actors helping them, was made a little more safe and secure, not least through EUFOR's paving the way for a longer-term UN operation. Chad and Car might have been unkindly described as the backyard of nowhere, not getting the attention focused on Darfur. But one very significant result of the EU's engagement in Chad and CAR is that now a very wide spectrum of people are very familiar with the problems of those two countries. Amongst those people are almost 11,000 European troops who served there with EUFOR, and I am proud to have had command of those troops and very privileged to have had a wonderful Irish contingent as part of. And brings me to my final input, and it's probably other lessons of what should be looking at, and I won't go into this in detail, but I'll just give out some bullet points that maybe prompt some questions. United Nations Security Council resolutions. Now, this is a hoary old chestnut, and there have been many discussions on the subject across everywhere, trying to ensure maximum input while allowing interpretation and flexibility to the implementers. However, there was a major issue for us in EUFOR Chad was the question of the follow-on forces. And to me, that was critical. We had a one-year mandate from IOC. It was very precise. We weren't legally able to, we could legally stay there to do, in extremis was the word used, to do operations after the 1 year. But the mandate was a possible follow-on force, which was no better. Then the European Union termed our operation as a bridging operation. Unfortunately, there was only one bank for the bridge. That was the bank you left from. There was no place for the bridge to go once we took off, and this was a big problem for us. In other areas, UN procedures do not allow for definitive commitments, whether it be forces or budgets, unless there is a Security Council resolution to legitimise the operation. And in our case, we did not receive that Security Council resolution until the 14th of January just gone, exactly 2 months prior to the handover. Too short, too problematic. And now, while we're speaking of the UN, the European Union also, we have to look at some issues here, and that is, you saw where we were appointed on the 15th of October. But the problem with that was that I, as Operation Commander on my appointment, was not privy to the detailed political, diplomatic and military planning which brought about the adoption of the joint action. So you were playing catch-up. And only that I had excellent policy advisors, and we mentioned Cyril Brennan already, but Pia Sellerup, who's a Danish lady, was able to keep me. I would have been absolutely drowning, because this is an issue. An awful lot had happened prior to I getting taking up the job. And then, of course, there are the big issues in this whole area, European security, internal in Europe. The question of a political issue of a standing OHQ, or at least an OHQ planning team. I mentioned there were 27 people when I arrived. It is a huge problem where you have an ad hoc, you're reinventing the wheel every time, and this is a difficulty. There are major political issues in Europe about this. That's why there are 5 OHQs at the moment. The strategic reserve. You'll note that I have no slide about it there. I didn't have any. I had I won't even say it was a gentleman's agreement, but it was the original nod, wink, wink, we look after you type of situation. Otherwise, this operation couldn't have gone ahead. And thankfully, we didn't need. But it raised the whole question of the future of battle groups. And I recall the Finnish Chief of Defence standing up at a meeting one time when the Nordic battle group was stood up. And he said, we want to give General Nash the battle group for his strategic reserve. Why can't we? And there were a number of, he was jumped on straight away by a number of countries who said, you cannot, that's not what they're for. He said, what are they for? And he brought in, which I didn't think they had any interest in rugby in Finland, but somebody had been talking to him and he said, well, it's like, he said, use it or lose it. And there were a lot of people navel-gazing, I can tell you, when that came about. Framework nation. A framework nation is most desirable. It must be identified as early as possible. And I have every sympathy for France in this situation, who did not put their hand up until quite late, even though they had been, as I said, the people who initiated. And you can see why. Because I had to defend, if France had come in with a framework nation earlier, well then the people who were knocking this mission would say, sure, it is a French operation. So therefore, there was a standoff period, and that was difficult. But there does require to be a framework nation. And also, a legal logistic nation is even more important. All of this whole area, drafting of Status of Force Agreement, legal expertise, logistic expertise, finance experts, the money that was involved in all of this, you need that support in order to get there. Now, it works well, but there are areas that could be developed. Marrying the UN and the EU models of peacekeeping, extremely difficult. The UN is a very large bureaucracy geared towards long-term deployment and commitments, whereas the EU is for rapid deployment, effects-oriented, and withdrawal as soon as possible. Quite frankly, the EU is a military concept-driven operation. That is 24 hours, 365 days a year. We wrote a confidential document which has been passed to Brussels. Mr. Lewan in the United Nations knows about it. Dr. Solana, people like that, they are looking at it. It has not gone on general to see, can we have a better way forward in the future? And hopefully something will come out of that later in the year. I won't go into the tactical air transport, we know about it. It is absolutely vital when you get 3,500 troops in a series of operations. Special forces, I mentioned already, used properly. Medical support. There is a problem with medical support in Europe, and there's going to be further problems with medical support. Because we have in our countries, because of budgetary and all that, we have the one-size-fits-all. In other words, there's only one medical system. The days of military hospitals and all of that are disappearing across the whole of Europe. Specialist hospitals. That is a problem. Indeed, I reckon there are only 5 nations in the world at the moment who are capable of supporting a military force in the field. The net result of that is that forces will not be able to deploy in the not-too-distant future. It will be a showstopper for peacekeeping. Conclude. EUFOR Chad RCA was an operation which was not expected to be mould-making, but has contributed handsomely to European security and defence policy. It did not solve the problems of Central Africa, but carried out its mandate professionally and has been accredited with contributing to a safe and secure environment. It has proven that Europe can deploy a multinational force into a hostile environment. It has proven that European forces can be effective operationally and logistically. Ladies and gentlemen, multinationality works. 26 nations, 23 of them from the European Union, and 3 third members. The concept of multidimensional operations works. Political, diplomatic, economic, and security. I contend, ladies and gentlemen, that this is the way forward. Thank you very much.